Hello, and welcome to the Sleep Story. I'm glad you're here. Wherever you've come from today, whatever the hours have asked of you, you can set all of that down now. There's no hurry here. There never is. Tonight, I'd like to take you somewhere small and warm. A little bakery called the Little Flower, tucked into the corner of a cobblestone square in a quiet town in the north of England. The kind of town where the rain falls soft and steady and the streets stay empty through the long hours before dawn. Inside, a lamp burns amber above a worn wooden work table. Copper bowls hang from their hooks, and the windows fog gently with the heat from the ovens. And there is a woman named Clara, who arrives before the rest of the world has thought to wake, and who knows the way that only certain people know that the work in front of you, done slowly and with full attention, is enough. It's a gentle story. Nothing much happens, and that is rather the point. But before we make our way there, I'd like you to take a moment for yourself. Find whatever position feels right. Shift the pillow. Pull the blanket a little closer, if you'd like. Let your body settle into the surface beneath you, and let your eyes, if they haven't already, come to rest. We'll take just a few quiet breaths together, and then we'll step out of the rain and into the warmth of the little flower. There's no need to be anywhere else tonight. Whatever the day held, the noise of it, the weight of it, the thousand small things that pulled at your attention, you can set all of that down now, right here, right where you are. Take a moment to notice your breath. Don't try to change it. Just feel it moving through you, quietly, the way it always has, in and out, steady and faithful. Whether you think about it or not, now let your next breath come in just a little slower than the last. Not forced, just a little more room. And as you breathe out, feel your shoulders drop. Not because you're trying to relax them, just because there's nothing left for them to hold up right now. Let your attention drift down through your body, down through your arms, which can be still now, down through your hands. Feel the weight of them, how warm and heavy they are, when you stop asking anything of them. Notice how the mattress holds you. It has been holding you this whole time, and you may not have fully let it, but you can let it now. You don't have to hover. You don't have to brace. You can simply be held. Feel the sheets against your skin. The soft, familiar weight of them. Whether they're cool or warm, there is something about the feeling of being tucked in, even loosely, that some part of you has always found comforting. It's a very old comfort. It goes back a long way. Let your head rest fully into your pillow. Soften the back of your neck. Soften the space behind your eyes. You're not watching for anything tonight. There's nothing to watch for. Take one more slow breath and let it go at whatever pace feels natural. You might notice your body getting heavier with each breath now. That's exactly right. That's the feeling you came here for. Every exhale carrying you a little further from the noise, a little deeper into the quiet. And when you're ready, whenever that is, there's no hurry. Let your eyes close. I'll be right here. Let me take you somewhere quiet tonight. The rain had been falling since before midnight. Clara knew this because she had heard it begin, that first soft shifting of air against her bedroom window, the pause before the drops found their rhythm, and then the steady, patient sound of autumn rain settling in for the night. She had lain still for a while, listening. Then her alarm had sounded at 3:30, and she had risen without reluctance, the way she always did. The way that still surprised her when she stopped to think about it. 3 years of early mornings, and still something in her was glad of them. She dressed in the dark. Wool jumper, thick socks, her apron folded over her arm. She moved through her small flat with the ease of long habit, not needing the lights, knowing the exact width of the hallway and the particular creak at the top of the stairs and the way the front door needed to be lifted slightly before the lock would turn. Outside, the street was wet and black and very quiet, the cobblestones shining under the lamp at the corner. The rain came down at a soft angle, fine as mist at this hour, and she pulled her collar up and walked the 4 minutes to the square with her head slightly bowed, breathing in the cool, damp air, the smell of wet stone and old leaves. The little flower stood at the corner of the square, exactly where it always had, exactly where it would always be. Clara stopped in front of it for just a moment, the way she still did, sometimes as if seeing it fresh. The old wooden sign, the painted letters, white on dark green, their edges worn soft. The front window, dark now, reflecting the street behind her in its old glass. She reached into her pocket for the keys. The lock turned with a sound she knew better than almost anything, a smooth, satisfying click. The door giving inward on a breath of warmth and flour, and something else that was simply the smell of the place itself. She stepped inside. For a moment she stood in the dark of the bakery, still and quiet, letting it settle around her. The rain continued outside. She could hear it clearly through the single-pane windows, each drop distinct, the whole of it a soft, continuous murmur, like a conversation happening just below the threshold of words. She breathed in. There was flour in the air, always. A faint, dusty sweetness that never quite left. There was the particular coolness of a room that had been closed through the night. And under it all, like something remembered rather than smelled, the ghost of every loaf that had ever been baked here. She crossed to the lamp. The click of the switch, and then the amber light fell across the worktable, warm and steady, and the bakery came slowly into being around her. The copper bowls hanging from their iron hooks along the far wall. The old wooden shelves with their rows of tins and jars. The cracked tile above the oven, the same crack that had been there when her aunt had run this place. The same crack she had stopped noticing, and then noticed again, and then stopped noticing once more. The worktable itself, wide and solid, dusted pale, with the flour that never entirely washed away, worn smooth at the edges where hands had rested against it for decades. Clara let out a long breath. She unwound her scarf and hung it on the hook by the door. She tied on her apron. She crossed to the oven and crouched slightly, reaching for the pilot dial with the particular care it required. The old oven had its moods, its hesitations, and she had learned them all. She turned the dial and heard the small sound of gas beginning to move, and then there was the click, click, click of the igniter, and then the soft, definitive sound of the pilot catching, a low blue flame blooming to life behind the grate. She let her hand rest near the oven door for a moment, feeling the first faint pulse of warmth. It would take 10 minutes to come up to temperature. It always did. She filled the kettle at the sink, listening to the water run, and set it on the small gas ring near the window. Then she stood there for a moment with her hands resting on the rim of the sink, looking out at the square. The rain moved in slow, diagonal lines through the circle of lamplight at the corner. The cobblestones were dark and gleaming. Nothing moved. The town was entirely asleep, and she was awake in it, and there was something she had always loved about that, something she could not entirely put into words, but that felt, in the early hours, like a particular kind of freedom. She began to gather what she needed. Flour first, lifted from the large earthenware crock in the corner, measured into the wide copper bowl with the dented rim, the one her aunt had used. The one Clara had kept using without ever making a deliberate decision to do so. The flour fell in a soft cascade, pale and fine, settling into the bowl with a sound like a quiet sigh. She leveled it with the flat of her hand. Then salt, pressed from the tips of her fingers. Then the yeast, crumbled from its small block into a second bowl with just enough warm water to wake it. And she stood watching it for a moment as it began its slow, patient work, the first tiny signs of life, a gentle foaming at the edges, the faint smell of it rising to meet her. Something ancient and alive, and very slightly sweet. The kettle began to murmur, not yet boiling, just warming, finding its way. Clara spooned tea leaves into the old brown pot and waited. This was one of the things she had come to understand about the early mornings. They could not be hurried. Not because there was no work to do. There was always work to do, always bread to make and ovens to watch and timings to track, but because the work itself resisted hurry. Bread resisted hurry. It had its own time, its own pace. And the only thing you could do was learn to move at the same speed. She had learned this in her first month here, when she had tried to rush approve and the loaves had come out heavy and sad, and she had stood at the work table feeling embarrassed without knowing who she was embarrassed in front of. After that, she had slowed down, and the bread had improved, and something in her had improved along with it. The kettle reached its boil, and she poured the water over the tea leaves, watching the color bloom out into the water like a slow, dark cloud. She set the lid on the pot. She stood there in the amber lamplight, with her hands wrapped around the warm body of the pot for a moment, and outside, the rain went on. She poured her tea when it was ready and set the mug on the corner of the work table. She pulled the copper bowl toward her and made a well in the center of the flour and poured in the water not all at once, but slowly, in stages, watching the flour begin to pull the moisture in at the edges of the well, beginning its transformation. She added the yeast mixture. She added a little more water. And then she began to mix. First with her fingers, drawing the flour in from the sides, pulling and pressing, the dough forming slowly under her hands from a shaggy, reluctant mass into something beginning to cohere. It was cool and rough at first, sticking to her palms, clinging between her fingers, and she worked it patiently, not fighting it, just attending to it, lifting and folding, pressing and turning. The flour on the work table came up white on her forearms. The copper bowl was warm against the heel of her hand. She moved the dough to the table and began to knead. There was nothing quite like this. She had tried to explain it once, to a friend who had asked what she loved about the work, and she had found herself without good words for it. It was not the same as liking a thing. It was more like alignment, the feeling of being entirely in the right place, doing the right thing, with no part of herself absent or wanting to be elsewhere. The dough pushed back against her with a gentle, living resistance, and she met it, heel of the hand pressing forward and down, then folding the dough back over itself, then turning it a quarter turn and pressing again, and again, falling into the rhythm of it the way you fall into a rhythm of breathing without deciding to. The dough changed under her hands. It was remarkable. Always. It had been remarkable the first time, and it was remarkable still. 3 years in, the way the dough went from rough and sticky to smooth, from reluctant to willing, the texture shifting under her palms from something grainy and uncertain to something soft and elastic and almost alive. She could feel it in her fingertips. The moment it crossed over, the moment it stopped resisting and started to yield, not in the way of something defeated, but in the way of something ready. She pressed a thumb gently into its surface and watched the small impression fill slowly back in. Ready. She tucked it back into the copper bowl and covered it with a cloth, then set it near the warm back of the oven where the heat would gather. It would need an hour, perhaps a little more. She washed her hands at the sink, watching the flour come away in the water, the surface of the water going cloudy and pale. She dried her hands on her apron. She picked up her mug of tea and stood for a moment in the amber light, listening. The rain. It was different now than it had been when she arrived. Softer, she thought. Or perhaps just more familiar, the way a sound becomes part of the room after a while, rather than coming in from outside. It moved against the windows with a light, continuous tapping, sometimes shifting in pitch or pressure as the wind changed direction slightly, sometimes dropping almost to silence and then returning, as constant and unhurrying as breath. She had never grown tired of it. In autumn especially, this sound, rain on single-pane glass in an old building on a cobblestone square, was something close to music. Not the music of drama or feeling, but the quieter kind. The music of continuity. She pulled the stool to the work table and sat. Her tea was cooling to the temperature she liked best, just below too hot, just above lukewarm, the particular temperature of real comfort rather than the performance of it. She wrapped both hands around the mug and let herself simply be still for a while. This was something else she had learned. Not every moment needed to be filled. In the early hours especially, there was something right and even necessary about sitting with the emptiness of a not yet finished room, letting the warmth of the oven accumulate around her, not doing anything in particular. She had thought, at first, that this was laziness, or perhaps a kind of hiding. She understood now that it was neither. It was simply that some things needed to be waited for, and waiting, done properly, done with full attention rather than restlessness, was not nothing. It was its own kind of work. The oven ticked and settled. The lamp cast its amber circle. The rain moved against the glass. Clara thought, as she sometimes did at this hour, of her aunt. Margaret had run this bakery for 22 years before her, and before that had worked in it as a girl, helping her own mother roll pastry on this same wide table. When she had offered it to Clara, phone call on a Tuesday evening, out of nowhere, or so it had seemed, she had not made it into a large thing. She had said she was going to the coast, and she thought Clara might like the bakery if she wanted it, and she had waited while Clara sat in her small flat in the city and stared at the wall and felt something shift in her chest in a way that frightened her with its completeness. She had said yes, the same night. She had not expected to feel so immediately that it was hers. Not in the small-minded sense of ownership, but in the sense of fit. The way a word you have always needed, but never had suddenly appears, and you recognize it instantly. The bakery had been like that. She had moved through it in those first weeks as though she were remembering it rather than learning it. The particular way the light fell in the afternoon, the exact spot on the third floorboard that sang under your feet. The knowledge that the back door needed to be pulled firm in damp weather or it would let in a thread of cold air along the bottom that no amount of weather stripping had ever entirely solved. She knew this place. It knew her. And yet, she stood from the stool and took her mug to the window. This feeling had come on gradually, over the last few months. She was not sure when she had first noticed it, or whether it had always been there, and she had simply not had language for it until now. It arrived most reliably around this hour, somewhere between 4 and 5 in the morning, when the dough was proofing and the bread was not yet in, when the work had paused and the bakery was very still and warm. It was not loneliness, she had decided. It was not exactly loneliness. It was more like the awareness of space, of a room large enough to share. A warmth that had no particular destination. She stood at the window with her tea and looked out at the square. The rain was still coming down, finer now than before, barely more than a mist in the lamplight, settling on the cobblestones and gathering in the cracks between them, running in thin silver lines toward the drain at the center of the square. The old fountain was a dark shape in the middle distance, its basin holding rain. The chemist's across the square was dark. The post office was dark. Everything was dark and closed and sleeping, which was as it should be, which she had always loved. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far edge of the lamplight's reach, just where the amber from her window met the dark of the square, a still figure in a long, dark coat. Not moving, simply standing, hands in pockets, face turned slightly toward the bakery window. He was an old man, she could tell from his posture, the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to hurry, and he was standing in the rain with no umbrella. And he had the look, even at this distance, of someone who had been walking for a while and had come, perhaps without entirely intending to a place where there was light. She knew him. She knew him the way you know the people who belong to the geography of your daily life, not intimately, not yet, but with the recognition that comes from presence. He was Edmund. He had the flat above the clockmakers, or what used to be the clockmakers, the chemist now. He walked the square most mornings. She had seen him often enough from the window, always alone, always unhurried, the kind of walk that was less about destination than about the need to move through the world for a while. She had never spoken to him. He had never come in. He was standing in the rain and looking at her window, and the amber light from inside was falling on the wet cobblestones around him in a soft golden pool, and his face, when she looked more closely, had the look of someone watching a fire from across a room. Clara stood very still. She watched him. He stood. The rain came down between them, fine and even, and the lamp at the corner made it silver where it crossed the light. She had not planned what she did next. She did not think about it in any particular way. She set her mug down on the work table, and she crossed to the door, and she opened it. The cool, damp air came in immediately, soft and smelling of rain and wet stone, and she stood in the doorway with the warmth of the bakery at her back and looked across the square to where the old man stood, and she said, quietly, not calling, just speaking, "Would you like to come in out of the rain?" A pause. She was not sure he had heard. Then he turned fully toward her, and even across the square she could see the faint surprise on his face, the way it moved through some private consideration, and then he began to walk toward her, slowly, crossing the cobblestones with careful steps. She stepped back. He came in out of the rain. He was taller than she had expected, in the way that people sometimes are when you encounter them in your actual space rather than at a distance. His coat was dark wool, wet at the shoulders and the collar, and his hair was white and slightly damp, and he looked around the bakery with the careful, unhurried gaze of someone taking in a room they have wanted to look at for a long time. She watched him notice the copper bowls, the lamp, the work table, pale with flour, the covered dough resting near the oven. "Edmund," she said, "I've seen you walking the square." "I know," he said. "I've seen your light. Most mornings." He paused. "I wasn't sure if you'd want company." "I've put the kettle on again," she said. He sat at the work table on the second stool, the one she never used, the one that had simply always been there, and she filled the kettle and set it on the ring and moved to the small shelf where she kept the cups. She could hear him settling, the quiet sound of a coat being unbuttoned, the slight shift of weight on the old stool. She listened to the rain while the kettle warmed. When she set the tea in front of him, he wrapped both hands around it immediately, the way very cold people do, holding the warmth rather than drinking it. She stood across from him on her own side of the work table, with her elbows resting on the wood, and for a while they were simply quiet together. It was not uncomfortable. It was, she found, the same quality of quiet that the bakery always held, except that it had a slightly different texture now, warmer, somehow, or perhaps more complete. "You used to be a clockmaker," she said. Not a question exactly. She had put it together from bits of knowledge accumulated over 3 years in a small town. 40 years, he said. He looked down at his tea. My father before me. In the shop across the square. He paused. It's the chemist now. I know. They kept the frontage, he said. And there was something in his voice, not bitterness, but something adjacent to it, something long settled and accepted, but not entirely gone. The old windows. The lettering. I suppose that's something. It is something, she said. He looked up at her then, and there was a quality in his gaze that she recognized, the look of someone who has been alone for long enough that a simple acknowledgement lands with more weight than it was probably intended to carry. She looked back at him steadily, and he nodded very slightly, and they both looked down at their tea. Your aunt ran this place, he said, after a while. She did. I always meant to visit, he said, when she was here. I used to hear the bread smell from my window in the early mornings. I thought, I'll go in tomorrow. And then tomorrow. He paused. You know how it is. I do. She moved to the coast. I heard. Whitby, Clara said. She's very happy there. Good, he said, and meant it. And that was the end of that particular thread. And they sat in a comfortable silence while the oven worked, and the rain moved against the glass. She lifted the cloth from the proofing dough and pressed 2 fingers gently into its surface, checking, and the impression held for a moment and then slowly began to fill back in. Ready. She began to portion it, cutting the dough into 4 even sections with the bench scraper, shaping each one with the same careful, rolling motion, tucking the edges under to build tension in the surface. Her hands moved from long memory, and she did not rush, and Edmund watched without speaking, and the watching felt companionable rather than scrutinizing. Do you always work in silence? He asked, after a while. I usually have the radio on, she said, at some point. But not at the beginning. At the beginning, I like to hear the rain. He nodded as if this made complete sense. He turned his cup slowly in his hands. I walk because of the quiet, he said. I'm a poor sleeper. Have been for years. The nights are very long when you're alone in them, he said it simply, without self-pity, the way you state a condition you have made your peace with. I find that walking helps. The town is different at this hour. Very small. Very still. It is, she said. She was sliding the shaped loaves onto the floured tray. I've thought that. You see the whole shape of it when it's quiet? I walked past a fox this morning, he said. Just past the post office. It sat in the road and looked at me and didn't move. He paused. We regarded each other for quite a long time. She smiled at the dough. Who looked away first? The fox, he said, with quiet dignity. Eventually, She slid the tray into the oven and closed the door with its familiar soft clunk and turned back to the work table. The oven settled around the loaves with its low, even hum. The lamp was steady above them, outside. The rain continued its patient work against the glass. No louder than before, no softer, simply there, as if it had always been there, as if it would always be. She poured them both more tea. Edmund told her about the square in winter. He told her about the fountain freezing in the hard winter of 3 years past. The water stopped mid-fall in a gray-white column that had stood for 11 days, and how people had come from 2 villages over to see it. He told her about the market that used to come in November, the stalls running from the corner where she stood all the way to the far edge of the square, the smell of spiced cider and wood smoke and something hot and sweet he had never been able to identify but had always associated with the beginning of winter. He told her about the couple who had run the wool shop until last year, in the building that was now empty, how they had argued passionately about everything and remained apparently devoted to each other for 45 years. He told her about the clockmaker's shop. He told her this more slowly, and she listened more carefully, understanding that this was the thing he had most to say about and least practice saying. About his father and the smell of machine oil and the particular sound a clock makes when it has been properly serviced, and you set it running again, that first tentative tick, like a small creature finding its feet. About how he had learned to sit very still, to hear what was wrong with a mechanism, to be quiet enough that the problem revealed itself to you, rather than you hunting for it. About how he had closed the shop 14 years ago when his hands had begun to shake, and how he had grieved it in the way you grieve a language you can no longer speak. "I still hear clocks," he said, "in the night. I know which ones have been wound and which haven't. I know the station clock, and the church clock, and the one above the tea rooms. And I can tell you when the church clock is running slow without looking at it." He paused. "It's been slow since September." "Is that a comfort?" she asked. "To still hear them?" He thought about this genuinely, the way people do when they are not used to being asked such questions, but find, on encountering one, that they have an honest answer. "Yes," he said, at last. "It's a comfort. It means I'm still attending to something." He looked at the oven. "Like your bread, like my bread," she agreed. The smell had been building for some time. She had been aware of it in the way you are aware of warmth from a fire, as a gradual accumulation, a deepening of what was already in the room. But now it was full and present and unmistakable. The smell of bread baking. Not raw bread, not the promising smell of proofing dough, but the full-grown smell of bread transforming in heat, that complex, yeasty, golden warmth that was somehow both simple and rich, both ancient and immediate. It settled into the bakery around them like a second warmth, layered over the warmth of the oven, filling the space above and below the amber lamplight, drifting in threads toward the fogged windows and the rain-dark glass. Edmund breathed it in without commenting on it, which she found she preferred to a compliment. He simply let it be what it was, and went on holding his cup. She checked the loaves twice, opening the oven door just far enough to feel the heat press against her face, to see the crust deepening to gold across the tops, to hear, and she heard this, as she always did, the very faint sound of the crust forming, a barely there whispering crackle. She closed the door. She waited. She stood near the work table with her forearms resting on its surface, and Edmund sat across from her in the lamplight, and the rain fell on the cobblestones outside, and time moved in the way it moved, in this bakery in the early hours, slowly, gently, without insistence. "I didn't think I'd come in," Edmund said at one point. "When you opened the door, I wasn't sure. He looked at his hands around the cup. I'm glad I did. So am I, she said. And she meant it without qualification, without the small hesitation she sometimes felt when saying things she meant fully. She simply meant it. When the loaves were ready, she knew before the timer told her. She always did. Something in the smell changed at the moment of doneness, a final deepening, a settling, like the last note of a piece of music finding its proper resolution. She lifted them from the oven with the padded gloves, setting them on the wire rack, and the sound they made when she turned them out, that hollow knock of crust on wood, was the sound she had loved since her first morning here and had not once stopped loving. She stood back and looked at them. 4 loaves, full and golden brown, their crusts cracked in long curves along the tops where they had risen and split in the heat, their color ranging from deep amber at the edges to something closer to honey at the center. They steamed very faintly in the cool air of the room, and the smell coming off them was extraordinary, fully realized now, no longer building toward something but simply being entirely what it was, warm and yeasty and clean and complete. Edmund had turned on his stool to look at them, and his face, in the lamplight, had the unguarded expression of someone witnessing something simple and fine. She let them rest. The rain was still falling outside, but she noticed, as she looked toward the window, that something was different about the quality of the darkness. It had shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, but she knew it the way you know all things you have watched closely for 3 years. The deep blue-black of pre-dawn had thinned slightly at the edges of the glass. Not light yet. Not anything you could call light, but the suggestion of the possibility of it, somewhere very far above the clouds. The town would begin to wake soon. She went to the shelf and found the brown paper, the wide roll of it, the color of old maps, and she tore off a generous length and laid it on the work table. She took one of the loaves, still slightly warm, and set it on the paper. She folded the edges over carefully, the way she always wrapped the loaves she was most pleased with, the corners turned in with precision, tucked rather than folded. Then she took the ball of kitchen string from its hook and cut a length and tied it around the package in a simple bow. She set it on the work table in front of Edmund. He looked at it. He looked at her. You don't have to, he began. Take it, she said. The other 3 are for the shop. This one's for you. He was quiet for a moment. He reached out and touched the string, very gently, with one finger, the way you touch something you're trying to understand the reality of. Then he stood slowly from the stool, rebuttoning his coat with the careful movements of someone whose hands had been cold and were only now fully warm again. He picked up the loaf and held it as if it had some weight to it beyond its physical weight. I'll come back, he said, in the morning, to buy bread, properly. A pause. If that's all right? The shop opens at 8, she said. He nodded. He looked around the bakery one more time, the copper bowls, the lamp, the flower pail work table, the way you look at a room you expect to return to and want to hold clearly in your mind. Then he looked at Clara, and his eyes were warm and steady in the lamplight, and he said, "Thank you," for the door. "Good morning, Edmund," she said. "Good morning," he said. She opened the door for him, and the cool air came in again with its smell of rain and wet stone and autumn, and he stepped out into the square. She stood in the doorway and watched him go. His footsteps on the cobblestones were careful and unhurried, each one landing with a soft, deliberate sound, a sound she felt she would remember, for some reason she could not name, for a very long time. The package was under his arm. His coat was dark against the gray-blue of the square. He walked without looking back, not out of indifference, but in the way of someone who is already turning a thing over in his mind, already carrying it home. She watched until he had crossed the square and turned the corner, and then she stood for a moment longer in the open doorway with the warmth at her back and the rain still falling, very gentle now, touching her face with something that barely counted as a sensation at all. Then she stepped back inside. She went to the window and turned the sign. Open. She stood in the center of the bakery and simply stood. The 3 remaining loaves were on the rack, cooling. The amber lamp was warm above the work table. The oven was settling into its lower register, the heat beginning to ease now that the loaves were out, ticking softly as metal contracts. The smell of fresh bread was in every corner of the room, not the concentrated smell of baking, not the dramatic heat smell of an open oven, but the quieter, more diffuse, more complete smell of bread that has been made and is done, that has moved through all its stages and arrived at itself. It was a smell that filled a space without demanding anything of you. It simply was there, surrounding her, as warm as the air itself. The windows had lightened. Not much, but enough. The cobblestones outside were visible now as individual shapes rather than a continuous dark, and the far edge of the square was becoming its own gray-blue rather than just the absence of light. It was not morning yet, not the morning that other people would recognize, not the morning that would bring voices and footsteps and the ordinary bustle of a market town waking, but it was the first part of it, the earliest edge, the gray beginning of a thing not yet begun. Clara untied her apron strings. She did it slowly, reaching behind her, feeling the bow give, the strings coming loose around her. She folded the apron and set it on the end of the worktable. She pulled the stool close and sat down, resting both arms on the warm wood, letting her weight settle. She thought about Edmund. She thought about the way he had held the loaf, the way he had said for the door, as if thanking her not just for opening it, but for the fact of there being a door to open. She thought about the 40 years and the clockmaker's shop and the fox outside the post office that had stayed until it chose to go. She thought about the long nights he had described, and the walking, and the amber light from her window that he had noticed and come to stand near without quite deciding to. She thought about her aunt, and this place, and the 3 years she had spent inside it, making bread before the town was awake. She thought about this particular feeling, this warm, slightly aching awareness of a room large enough to share, and she found, sitting in the lamplight with the smell of bread around her and the rain now very quiet and very far away, that she could see it differently than she had before. Not as a want, not as something missing. More like something already arriving. Something that had been arriving slowly, in the way that warmth arrives in stone that has been cold for a long time. Not suddenly, not all at once, but inexorably and deeply, and in a way that will last. She had been here 3 years. She knew every creak and draft and temperamental dial. She knew the smell of the square in the rain. She knew the sound of a loaf that is ready before the timer says so. She knew, now, that an old man named Edmund liked to walk the square in the dark hours when sleep would not come, and that he had watched her window for some time without knowing what to do about it, and that he took his tea with both hands wrapped around the cup. She was not alone. She was early. Only that. She was early, and the rest of it was coming. The way mornings come slowly, gently, without being hurried, arriving in full when it arrives. She let her eyes rest on the window. The light was softening there. The glass no longer fully dark, holding now the first pale gray of a morning that would not rush. The rain touched the pane. She could hear each drop. She could smell the bread. The lamp above her was steady and warm, its amber circle falling across the flour-dusted wood, across her arms, across the empty stool on the other side of the table. She let her eyes close. Just for a moment, the lamp glowed on above her. The rain fell softly on the old glass. The bread cooled on the rack, releasing its warmth slowly into the room. The oven ticked its quiet tick. The square outside was gray and still, and the town was beginning, somewhere, very far away, to stir. And across the square, in the particular silence of a northern autumn morning before the world has properly woken, an old man walked slowly home through the rain, a warm loaf tucked under his arm, and the cobblestones shone beneath his feet, and the lamplight at the corner touched his white hair as he passed beneath it, and he walked on, unhurrying into the gray and gentle morning.